Everyone else just saw a fishing boat, but Harold's eyes caught different details. The boat sitting too deep in the water, no fishing equipment visible, and the crew's nervous behavior as they approached the shore. 30 years of Coast Guard intelligence experience doesn't just disappear. This boat wasn't here to catch fish. It was here to deliver something far more dangerous. Welcome to Echo Stories. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden vigilance and unexpected heroism, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button, because the most powerful protectors often hide in plain sight, walking among us every single day, watching over communities in ways we never imagine. Sunset Beach, California. A pristine stretch of coastline where families gathered for weekend picnics, surfers caught morning waves, and retirees took peaceful walks along the shore. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened, where the biggest excitement was usually a volleyball tournament or a sea lion spotting. Harold "Hal" Morrison, 68 years old, was one of those regular beach walkers. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., rain or shine, he'd make his way down to the water's edge and begin his routine patrol, though nobody called it that except Harold himself. To everyone else, he was just a lonely retiree with too much time on his hands. He'd nod politely to the joggers, wave at the early morning fishermen, and occasionally help a lost tourist find their way back to the parking lot. He never talked about his past, never mentioned what he used to do for work. If anyone asked, Harold would simply say he was former government service and change the subject. He preferred it that way. After 3 decades with Coast Guard intelligence, specializing in maritime security and human trafficking interdiction, Harold had seen enough darkness to last several lifetimes. But retirement hadn't dulled his instincts. If anything, the quiet beach walks had sharpened them. Every morning, Harold's trained eyes scanned the horizon, noting vessel patterns, unusual activity, anything that didn't belong in the peaceful routine of Sunset Beach. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. Harold was making his usual circuit along the beach when something caught his attention about a quarter-mile offshore. A mid-sized fishing vessel, maybe 40 feet long, was approaching the coast at an unusual angle. Harold paused, pulled out the small binoculars he always carried, a habit from his Coast Guard days that he'd never broken. As he focused on the vessel, his trained mind immediately began cataloging details that would be invisible to civilian eyes. The boat was riding low in the water, much lower than a fishing vessel should, unless it was carrying an extremely heavy catch. But there were no nets visible, no outrigger poles, none of the standard commercial fishing equipment you'd expect to see. More concerning was the crew's behavior. Through his binoculars, Harold could see at least 4 men on deck, and they kept looking nervously toward the shore, checking their watches, clearly agitated about something. One of them was on a radio, speaking animatedly to someone. Harold's internal alarm system, fine-tuned over decades of maritime law enforcement, was now fully activated. This wasn't a fishing expedition. This was something else entirely. Harold moved to a better vantage point behind some rocks, keeping the vessel in sight while remaining concealed. His Coast Guard training had taught him that successful interdiction relied on observation and intelligence gathering before action. The boat's registration numbers were partially obscured, a red flag in itself. Legitimate fishing vessels didn't hide their identification. Harold made mental notes: approximate length, hull color, engine configuration, number of crew members visible, but it was the human cargo that confirmed his worst suspicions. As the boat drew closer to shore, Harold could see movement below deck, shadows of people who clearly weren't crew members. Through gaps in the boat's cabin structure, he caught glimpses of huddled figures, far more people than any fishing crew would require. Harold's blood ran cold. He'd seen this exact pattern dozens of times during his career. Human smuggling operations using legitimate-looking fishing vessels to transport victims along the California coast. These operations had grown increasingly sophisticated over the years, but the basic pattern remained the same. The boat was now close enough that Harold could hear voices carrying across the water. Most were speaking Spanish, and many sounded frightened, desperate. Children's voices mixed with adults, families, Harold realized. This wasn't just smuggling. This was human trafficking on a large scale. Harold's first instinct was to call the Coast Guard immediately. He still had contacts, people who would take his call seriously and respond quickly. But as he reached for his phone, the situation began evolving rapidly. The boat's crew was clearly preparing for a quick landing. One man had jumped into the water and was wading toward shore, checking the depth and looking for obstacles. Another was herding the passengers. Harold could now see there were at least 20 people crammed into the small vessel toward the front of the boat. Time was running out. Even if Harold called for backup now, it would take the Coast Guard at least 30 minutes to reach this location. By then, the traffickers would have offloaded their human cargo and disappeared into the maze of coastal roads and safe houses that Harold knew existed throughout Southern California. Worse, Harold could see that some of the passengers looked to be in serious medical distress. The cramped conditions, long sea voyage, and obvious dehydration were taking their toll. Several people appeared to be unconscious or close to it. This was the moment every law enforcement officer dreads, when immediate action is required, but backup is nowhere to be found. Harold Morrison had spent 30 years of his life protecting people in exactly these kinds of situations. Coast Guard intelligence had trained him to think like the criminals, to anticipate their moves, to always be 3 steps ahead of human traffickers who treated desperate people like cargo. Those instincts didn't retire when Harold did. He quickly assessed his options. The traffickers clearly planned to beach the boat and move their victims quickly to waiting vehicles. Harold could now see a van parked in the beach access area that he'd initially dismissed as early morning surfers. Harold couldn't stop 20 armed traffickers by himself, but he could disrupt their operation long enough to give the authorities time to respond. And more importantly, he could potentially save the lives of people who were obviously in immediate danger. Harold pulled out his phone and dialed 911, giving the dispatcher precise coordinates and a detailed description of the situation. Then he called his old contact at Coast Guard Intelligence, a favor he'd been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. But calling for help wasn't enough. Harold could see that several of the passengers were in critical condition, and the traffickers were clearly planning to abandon anyone who couldn't move quickly. In his Coast Guard career, Harold had seen traffickers leave sick or injured victims to die rather than risk their operation. That wasn't happening on Harold's beach. Harold moved quickly but quietly along the shoreline, using the morning fog and beach terrain to stay hidden while positioning himself between the boat and the waiting vehicle. His Coast Guard training included small unit tactics, and even at 68, Harold remembered how to use environment and surprise to overcome superior numbers. The boat was now close enough to shore that the crew was preparing to wade in. Harold could hear them shouting instructions in Spanish, organizing their passengers for a quick transfer. Several of the traffickers had weapons visible. This was clearly a professional operation with serious backing, but Harold had advantages they didn't know about. He knew this stretch of beach intimately, including several features that weren't visible from the water. There was a small tidal channel just north of where they were landing that would force them to move single file. There were also several large rocks that would provide cover and create natural choke points. More importantly, Harold had called in backup with information that would allow the Coast Guard to intercept any escape attempt by sea, while local police would cover the land routes. The traffickers were about to find themselves trapped, but they didn't know it yet. Harold's plan was simple: delay the operation long enough for backup to arrive while preventing any harm to the victims. It was essentially the same mission he'd carried out dozens of times during his career, just without official authority or backup immediately available. As the first traffickers reached the beach, Harold stepped out from behind the rocks where he'd been concealed. He was holding his phone visibly, and his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd been in command. U.S. Coast Guard Intelligence. This area is under surveillance and backup is en route. Release the passengers immediately and return to your vessel. The effect was immediate and exactly what Harold had hoped for. The traffickers froze, clearly shocked to encounter law enforcement in what they'd believed was an isolated location. Several of them reached for weapons, but Harold's next words stopped them. Satellite surveillance has been tracking this vessel for the past hour. Coast Guard cutters are already moving to intercept. Your only chance is to release the passengers and surrender now. It was a complete bluff. Harold had no satellite support and the Coast Guard response was still 20 minutes away. but his tone, his bearing, and the confidence in his voice made it believable. More importantly, the traffickers had no way to verify what he was saying. The lead trafficker, a man in his 40s with gang tattoos and obvious military experience of his own, studied Harold carefully. "You're retired, old man. I can see it in your eyes. How many backup do you really have?" Harold smiled grimly. "Why don't you test that theory?" What followed was a tense psychological battle between Harold's decades of experience and the traffickers' desperation to complete their operation. Harold knew that traffickers relied on speed and surprise. Any delay increased their risk exponentially. The traffickers knew they had superior numbers and firepower, but they also knew that engaging with any law enforcement, even a single retired agent, would bring massive official response. Their entire operation depended on staying below the radar. Harold used every psychological tactic he'd learned during his career. He spoke with absolute confidence about backup that was already in position. He referenced specific details about their operation that he'd observed, making it clear he'd been watching them for some time. Most importantly, he kept his attention divided between the traffickers and their victims, making it clear that any violence would be met with immediate escalation. The passengers, meanwhile, were clearly terrified, but beginning to realize that someone was trying to help them. Several were obviously in medical distress, and Harold could see that at least 2 were children who appeared to be traveling without family members. The standoff continued for several minutes, with the traffickers trying to decide whether to risk violence, retreat to their boat, or continue with their original plan. Harold used every second to assess their weapons, count their numbers, and identify the most dangerous individuals. Then the sound of distant sirens began echoing across the water. The Coast Guard response was faster than Harold had expected and more comprehensive. Not only had his contact mobilized a cutter, but the 911 call had brought local police, Border Patrol, and even an FBI human trafficking unit that happened to be operating in the area. As the sirens grew louder and a Coast Guard helicopter appeared on the horizon, the traffickers realized their operation was blown. Several of them immediately began wading back toward their boat, abandoning the passengers on the beach. But Harold wasn't finished with them. "Those people need medical attention," he called out to the retreating traffickers. "Some of them won't survive if you leave them here without treatment." The lead trafficker turned back, weapon raised. "This isn't over, old man." Harold's response came from 30 years of facing down criminals who threatened innocent people. "Yes, it is." The Coast Guard helicopter was now close enough that Harold could see the boarding team preparing to fast rope onto the boat. The traffickers' vessel was surrounded, their escape routes cut off, and their operation completely compromised. More importantly, the passengers were safe and would receive the medical attention and legal assistance they desperately needed. In the hours that followed, Harold found himself giving detailed statements to multiple law enforcement agencies. His observations and tactical intervention had not only prevented a major human trafficking operation, but had provided intelligence that led to arrests throughout the trafficking network. The local police chief, a woman named Captain Sarah Rodriguez, pulled Harold aside after the initial interviews. "Mr. Morrison, I have to ask, your response was incredibly professional. What's your background?" Harold handed her a business card he'd kept in his wallet for 8 years, even though it was long expired. "Coast Guard Intelligence, Maritime Security Division. Retired." Captain Rodriguez examined the card, then looked back at Harold with new respect. 30 years? 32, actually. Specialized in exactly this kind of operation. Why didn't you tell us that when you called it in?" Harold looked out at the beach, where EMTs were treating the trafficking victims and Coast Guard investigators were processing evidence. "Because it doesn't matter who I used to be. What matters is who needed help today." Word of Harold's intervention spread quickly through Sunset Beach. Local news picked up the story, though Harold declined all interview requests. The beach community, which had always seen him as a quiet, somewhat antisocial retiree, suddenly understood that they'd been living under the protection of someone they'd never really noticed. The morning joggers began stopping to chat with Harold during his walks. The local coffee shop started offering him free drinks. Children playing on the beach would wave when they saw him patrolling, but Harold was uncomfortable with the attention. He'd spent his career working in the shadows, and retirement hadn't changed his preference for anonymity. "I just did what anyone should do. he told the few reporters who managed to track him down. If you see something wrong, you try to fix it. Harold's intervention had disrupted more than just one trafficking operation. The intelligence gathered from the boat and its passengers led to the discovery of a major trafficking network operating along the entire West Coast. FBI agent Maria Santos, who led the investigation, contacted Harold several weeks later. "Mr. Morrison, would you consider consulting on this case? Your experience with maritime trafficking is exactly what we need." Harold thought about it for several days. He'd retired for good reasons. The work was emotionally exhausting, the hours were unpredictable, and he'd wanted to enjoy his golden years in peace. But he also understood that his experience was valuable, and there were still people out there who needed protection. "Limited consulting only," Harold finally agreed. "And I'm not coming out of retirement. I just want to help when I can." 6 months later, Harold was back to his morning beach walks, though they were no longer quite as solitary. Several other retired law enforcement officers had moved to the area, drawn by the community and Harold's quiet leadership. The beach patrol was now unofficial but real. Every morning, trained eyes scanned the horizon, not just Harold's but those of former FBI agents, retired police officers, and other veterans who understood that vigilance never really retires. Harold still preferred to be alone with his thoughts during his early morning walks, but he'd accepted that his peaceful retirement had evolved into something different, a community of protectors who watched over a stretch of coastline that had become safer because of their presence. The trafficking networks had taken notice too. Intelligence reports suggested that Sunset Beach was now considered a high-risk landing site by criminal organizations, meaning they would look for easier targets elsewhere. Harold was satisfied with that outcome. He'd spent 30 years chasing criminals around the world. Now he was content to stand guard over one small piece of paradise, making sure it stayed safe for the families who came to enjoy the surf and sand. And so, on a quiet California beach, it was proven once again that the most powerful protectors often work in silence. A man who appeared to be just another retiree taking morning walks was actually a guardian, using decades of experience to watch over a community that never knew they needed protection. Real heroes don't retire from caring about others. They just find new ways to serve, new communities to protect, and new reasons to stay vigilant. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. And remember, that quiet person taking daily walks in your neighborhood might be watching over you in ways you never imagined.